There we go, everybody. Good morning and welcome to our June webinar. June, yes, correct. It's still June. It's also our birthday month. It's TVDM's third birthday, if you can believe it or not. I can't. Time has flown. What do they say about time flying when you're having fun? It's most certainly been a very eventful 3 years and lots of fun. There's been some blood, sweat, and tears, more tears than blood and sweat, luckily. But it's most certainly been a fantastic experience for Nicole Tavares and myself. We were welcomed, well, rather we were joined by Nicole Nell that we welcomed about 1.5 years ago, followed by Kyle. Kyle has made real leaps and bounds with our marketing, which I'm sure that you all agree, and we're very, very thankful to have him and his bright ideas on our side. And then we've got Matthew. He's our newest addition, and he's one of our fellow consultants. Matthew has recently been admitted, which is very, very exciting. And Nicole, believe it or not, is more than halfway through her LLM degree, which is very scary because that has flown by incredibly fast. And over the years, we were also joined by Lamise and by Tashreeq, who are no longer with us, but most certainly still part of the TVDM family. So ladies and gents, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kyle, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the events that we've got coming up, followed by Nicole and Matthew, that's going to be chatting to you about our topic this morning. If you don't have any background noise, please feel free to unmute yourself and participate. If so, just keep it muted, put your hand up, pop any questions you might have in the chat function. And when we get going, Carl's also going to share some links to our neighborhood, to our newsletter to sign up if you haven't yet signed up, and then, of course, to our future events. Carl, if you can also add our trustee training that we are partnering with Strativen, that'll be fantastic. And we'll talk about that towards the end. All right, Carl, over to you.
Thanks, Linda. So good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing well, and thank you so much for tuning in to our birthday webinar this morning. As Linda mentioned, this is going to be recorded and will be published on our YouTube channel, so please remember to like and subscribe to our channel. If you haven't already, please do sign up to our newsletter. This way you can keep in touch with the TVDM Consultants team. We've also just done a renovation on our newsletter, so please let us know what your thoughts are. We're very interested to know. We've also just relocated our neighborhood to a brand new platform. If you haven't seen it, then please go check it out. We're really excited about the potential that this new platform has. If you have any questions, please send me an email. I'll be glad to help. If you're interested in exploring our neighborhood, then you're welcome to take out common property or the managing agent package to view the platform at no expense. If you're looking for training, then also make sure to check out Strativen's trustee training in conjunction with TVDM Consultants. I'll also post a link for this in the chat below. Then Let's Get Physical is returning, and this time around we will be in George on the 4th of August at the Protea Hotel. So if you're in the area, then make sure you don't miss out on this one. I'm going to add all the relevant links in the comment section below, and I hope everyone enjoys the webinar today. Thanks.
Cool. Cool. So as mentioned, everyone, welcome to our third birthday webinar. Today, Matthew and I will be talking about preparation for annual general meetings. I know that this is always a hot topic. Us as the consultants always get questions about, was this meeting called correctly? Was the notice sent correctly? Who's allowed to attend? Is this proxy valid? All of those fun questions, and hopefully today we can give you a bit more clarity and hopefully answer some questions that you might be having. We're hoping to have a nice question and answer slot at the end, where we're hoping that you can tell us some of your AGM stories and things that maybe you find you've struggled with. Cool. So without any further ado, I'm going to kick us off with, why do bodies corporate actually need to have AGMs? So, as we all know, I hope, Section 7.1 of the STSMA says that the functions and the powers of a body corporate are performed and exercised by the trustees. We know that. However, because of the trustees being the main actors within the body corporate, members are often not left out, but don't often consider a lot of decisions that are taken throughout the financial year and therefore the AGM is of utmost importance to bring the members up to speed with what's happened in the past financial year, as well as for them to approve and consider any of the documents and relevant decisions for the body corporate in the upcoming financial year. Cool. Then over to Matthew with how an AGM is called.
Thanks, Nicole. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. So how an AGM is called, you would first need to differentiate between whether there's special business on the agenda or if it's just a bog standard AGM. So by special business, we mean if you're tabling unanimous or special resolutions at that meeting to be voted on. If you will be doing so, you need to call the meeting with at least 30 days written notice as required by section 6, subsection 2 of the STSMA. And then if no resolutions will be tabled like special or unanimous resolutions, a notice period of 14 days written notice is required. So what's part of that notice? Obviously, you will mention where the meeting will be held virtually or the venue, the date and the time of the AGM. And that must be given to all members, including the registered bondholders, those holders of future development rights, and the managing agent as well. Now, all of those aforementioned people can waive their right to notice in writing and deliver it to the appointed address of the body corporate before the meeting, bearing in mind that they can always revoke that waiver that they've given. So it's not a permanent thing. You can give that waiver to notice before, and you can waive it if you change your mind on the date of the meeting and you actually, or whenever. It's not a permanent thing. So the notice can be delivered to members with their service address in terms of PMR 4.5. The default is that's the address of the section, the primary section that's registered in that member's name, but that member can always change their appointed address by giving notice in writing to the body corporate, which we recommend, for example, changing it to their email address. Of course, we're dealing with a prepaid registered mail debacle with the post office, so it's absolutely recommended for owners or to request owners to change their service address in terms of PMR 4.5. Perfect. Okay, you can go, Nicole, on how an AGM is called.
Perfect. So further to what Matthew said, an AGM can actually be called on shorter notice than 30 days. So for example, on 7 days notice, if the trustees by trustee resolution decide that short notice might be necessary due to an emergency or perhaps an urgent matter that needs to be discussed and considered by the members, or otherwise less than 14 days notice, if all the members, because in writing by all persons entitled to attend essentially means every single member or person that has a participation or voting right in the scheme needs to waive the right for a shorter notice period. And then something that's really important to note, and that we also like to reiterate at any AGMs that we chair or attend, is that a failure of the body corporate to give proper notice to a person entitled to receive it does not invalidate any votes taken at the AGM, as long as the body corporate made a reasonable attempt to give the notice. For example, Matthew was speaking about the whole post office debacle in South Africa at the moment. And I know at some AGMs that I've attended, there's some members who it's been 2 months and they're still waiting on the notice pack to come through the registered mail. So it's always just safer to, our recommendation at least, is to, of course, send everything out via the registered postal system, but then always sending out the pack via email or any other convenient means to get the members to attend the meeting. And then further to what I said, the voting at the AGM obviously then can still take place despite the lack of notice delivered if all persons entitled to receive such notice waive their right to notice in writing. Now that's just a fancy way of saying the meeting can go ahead if all the people there agree that it may do so. I know Zelinda always likes to say, well, I don't see how it's a disadvantage because you're still here at the meeting, which means you must have seen the notice somehow. So that's always a good way to consider it and a good way to move forward and get the AGM started. Perfect.
Cool. So where must the AGM be held and who may attend the AGM? So PMR 15 form states that a general meeting has to be held within the local municipal area where your scheme is located if it's a physical meeting venue, unless your members have resolved by special resolution otherwise, which isn't very common, but what is indeed very common is now for AGMs to be held by online platform. So Zoom, Microsoft Teams. If people attend by that online platform and it was part of your notice for the meeting, they would be considered to be present in person at that AGM if they attended on Zoom or on Microsoft Teams or virtually online. But there are certain conditions for that as prescribed by PMR 1710, which states that the body corporate may do the AGM attendance by telephone, by online, any other method, but it must be accessible to all attendees. They should be able to participate in the meeting, and the chairperson can clearly identify all of the attendees as well. So all members may attend the AGM. So everybody, including your bondholders, future development right holders, and the managing agent can attend and speak on any matter in the agenda. But importantly, they can't propose any motion and they can't vote on a motion that's proposed. So there's another provision in terms of PMR 15.5 that states that should members of the AGM resolve at the AGM that the presence of one of the above mentioned persons unreasonably interferes in the interests of the body corporate or anybody's privacies interfered with by their presence, that person can be asked to leave the AGM as they're no longer entitled to attend it if the members resolve at that AGM on the above. Cool.
And then further to what Matthew said, the AGM has to be held within 4 months of a body corporate's financial year. Interestingly, Matthew and I have had quite a few queries recently with regard to the fact that this actually doesn't make any sense when you consider the fact that if it's 4 months after the body corporate's financial year has ended, there is essentially a quarter of a year period that a new budget is being implemented without actually being voted on by the members. And one of our colleagues actually came to us and said that, yes, of course, the SDSMA does provide for that maximum 10% interim levy increase that trustees can impose before, it's officially accepted by members in the budget. But often, and especially with inflation and things like that, this is not enough, especially in the modern economy. So what a lot of schemes are finding at the moment is that this 4-month period is actually quite detrimental, especially when coming to the finances. So we have been considering, if you are looking at amending your management rules, maybe making this a bit shorter of a time period to kind of account for that loss of, or that deficit from that levy increase. And then lastly, an AGM is actually not required to be held if before or within 1 month of the body corporate's financial year end, all members waive their right to an AGM and consent in writing to all the motions and resolutions that are meant to be dealt with. So basically what that means is if you don't want to have an AGM, that's 100% okay, but every single member will need to waive their right to attend such meeting, and every single resolution will have to be taken via round robin. And in order for those ordinary resolutions to be approved, 100% of members will have to consent to them, which is quite ridiculous. So in our opinion, just have an AGM.
Agreed. So what should be included as items or business items as part of the AGM? This is provided for in PMR 17.6, and it's the proxies, trustee nominations, and member representatives being confirmed firstly. The quorum needs to be confirmed as well and determined, so that will obviously differ depending on whether there's special business tabled or not. The chairperson being elected if necessary. This is usually the chairperson of the trustees, but it could be an independent party. And if it is an independent party, the chairperson has to ask if there are any objections to them chairing the meeting. Proof or waiver of the meeting notice being presented. So if any members waive their right to receive notice, that needs to be presented to the members at the meeting as well. The agenda of the AGM being approved, of course, the minutes of the previous AGM being approved, and then dealing with any unfinished business from the previous meetings, if any. The annual trustees report is received by the members, so that's usually included as part of your meeting pack, and you'll just confirm that the members have got sight of that and they've received it, and if there's any questions on that as well. And then the schedule of insurance replacement values with or without amendments as approved by the members as well. Then number 10, the extent of the insurance cover needed by the body corporate must be determined by the members as well. The administrative and reserve fund budgets for the upcoming financial year should be presented and approved by the members. And then the annual financial statements must be considered. So this isn't a voting item, but it's where the members confirm that they've considered and caught sight of those annual financial statements. Then importantly, confirmation of who's appointed as the auditor to audit those annual financial statements, and that is appointed by the members. Then the number of trustees must be determined, if applicable, and of course, the election of those trustees by the members will take place at the AGM as well. And then any amendments to the body corporate's rules must be voted on, if applicable. If it's your conduct rules, that's by special resolution. If it's your management rules, that's by unanimous resolution. And that will, of course, change the quorum requirements and the meeting notice period requirements as well, if you will be tabling amendments for the body corporate's rules. Any new or further business has to be dealt with, or if applicable, and then directions must be given or restrictions imposed on the incoming trustees by the members, not super necessary, but if applicable, that can be done as well. And then the meeting will be closed by the chairperson thereafter.
Perfect. So Matthew just touched on who chairs the AGM. So we're just going to dive a bit deeper into that. So PMR 18 says that it's the chairperson of the trustees unless otherwise resolved by members at a meeting. What we like to do if we are chairing a meeting is we usually just like to ask if anybody has any objections. Usually no one really has an objection, as we are an independent third party when attending and chairing meetings on behalf of bodies corporates, and then we just move on. Usually when it's the chairperson of the trustees, a lot of the time in my experience, that item isn't even considered in the agenda. And I think a lot of people forget that the duties of the chairperson are actually provided for and are statutorily provided for in the STSMA, and actually say that you as chairperson need to maintain order of the meeting, ensure that all motions and amendments proposed are within the scope of the notice, as well as the powers of those present at the meeting. Ensuring that all documents relevant to the items of business that are being considered or voted on at the meeting are available at the AGM. The chairperson must also act fairly and impartially towards all attendees at the AGM, even if they might not be their favorite member, and ensuring that all attendees are fully able to participate in the meeting, adjourning the meeting when necessary if things get a little bit too heated, and then making a decision on procedural points, settling disputes by giving rulings on points of order, and surrendering the chair when wishing to engage in the debate of any item of business. That last one is very important, considering that when in the role of chair of the meeting, you have to remain impartial and independent, not imposing your opinion and beliefs on the matter and influencing other members, as per the last point.
Perfect. So what is the quorum requirements for an AGM? Now, this will obviously differ depending on whether you will be tabling a unanimous resolution at your AGM, but the crux of it is that where no quorum is present, no business can be transacted at that AGM. So PMR 19.2 provides that where you're not tabling a unanimous resolution, your quorum requirement is 33.3% of the total votes of members in value. Now, in terms of that calculation, you don't take into account the value of votes of the developer of the body corporate, or those votes that the body corporate has itself. So it's just those members in value present where there's no unanimous resolution, 33.3%. If you're tabling a unanimous resolution, your quorum then jumps up to 80% of the total votes of members, both in number and in value. So if there's no quorum present within the first 30 minutes from the start of your AGM, then you can't proceed with business at that AGM. That AGM is then adjourned to the same day, the following week, at the same place and time. If there's no quorum that next week at the AGM, then you may proceed within 30 minutes. And whoever members are present or entitled to vote will constitute the necessary quorum, provided that no less than 2 parties or members are present at that meeting.
Perfect. And now I think the juiciest part of an AGM is who is entitled to vote and who is entitled to represent members at an AGM. So unlike in the Sectional Titles Act of 1986, the STSMA provides that a motion no longer needs to be seconded, but only needs to be proposed. I can't tell you how many management rules and just general rules I see that still make motion. Actually, Matthew and I were working on a set yesterday that still made mention of a proposer and a seconder. And I'm actually glad that they did away with this requirement, because I think it created just that extra bit of admin hassle. But anyways, and besides special or unanimous resolutions, all motions must be adopted by a resolution of the majority of votes calculated in value of the members present and voting. My company law lecturer always used to tell me, or used to tell the class, that a majority vote is 50% plus one person. No matter what portion or what PQ that one person holds, it's 50% plus one person. So that's always a good way to think about it if you are struggling to figure it out. But usually the ordinary or majority resolutions are the simple ones. And then this is a very hot topic, is that a member, despite what any rules might say, in a body corporate will always be entitled to vote in respect of a special or unanimous resolution, but will not be entitled to vote with regard to ordinary resolutions if that member fails to pay to the body corporate any amount that is due and payable after a court or adjudicator has given a judgment or order for payment of the outstanding amount, or if that member persistently breaches any of the conduct rules of the scheme after a court or adjudicator has given a judgment or order to refrain from further breaches of the rules. So essentially, a member is entitled to vote on anything until CSOS tells them that they may not. It's a good way to think about it. And then on to proxies. Very, very important. In order for a proxy to fully participate and represent a member at the AGM, the proxy form must be completed and delivered to the body corporate 48 hours before the AGM, or handed to the chairperson before the start of the AGM. Now, the proxy form, even though there is a form in terms of the STSMA, I think it's Annexure 3, that is the form, but the STSMA provides that any proxy form must substantially be in that format. In our opinion, as long as you can see who the owner of the unit is, who the proxy is, what the date of the proxy is, any particular instructions for the proxy, and for how long this person is going to be holding the proxy. For example, is it just for this meeting, or is it for the next few meetings, that kind of thing. It is validly signed, it's a valid proxy. Furthermore, with things being online, as Matthew mentioned, it's obviously very difficult to hand a proxy form to the chairperson before the start of the meeting. So if you are having a virtual AGM, it's always my recommendation that if you haven't handed in your proxy form 48 hours before, but you would still like to submit a proxy before the start of the meeting, I would always just recommend emailing the chairperson, CC in the managing agent with the signed proxy forms, and try and make sure that the read receipt is on, so that there's no way that it can't be proven that it wasn't sent before the start of the meeting. Perfect. And then a proxy, despite what people believe, cannot be the managing agent or any of the managing agent's employees. It can't be an employee of the body corporate, so it can't be a caretaker, it can't be a facility manager, and it can't be any other member of the body corporate that's already holding 2 proxies in addition to their own votes, or any person who's not a member that's just holding 2 proxies. And then this is something that I actually had to deal with recently, where I was representing a unit that was co-owned and only one owner had signed the proxy form. Luckily, I noticed this quite a while before the meeting, and I had the time to say to them, listen, because your unit is co-owned, both of you need to sign the proxy form, otherwise it will be invalid. So that's really, really important. If 2 or more persons jointly exercise 1 vote in respect of a section, so, if it's co-owned, then only 1 vote may be exercised and both people have to appoint a proxy. And then lastly, PMR 28 provides that the outcome of each vote, including the number of votes for and against, must be announced by the chairperson at the AGM and recorded in the minutes. I've heard a lot of times of people saying, oh, just give us some time to count the votes and we'll let you know tomorrow morning. That's a bit suspicious. I think that it's always good. Well, I mean, it's the law that it must be counted at the meeting, and members need to know the outcome of the resolutions then and there as soon as the results have been counted. Yeah, so I think that's, and I mean, there's a lot more things that we can talk about with AGMs, but I think in terms of preparation and everything that takes part beforehand, I'm hoping that this can provide people with a bit more of a roadmap and can assist you with anything, any tips, queries, questions you might have when wondering about going about the preparation of your AGM. So yeah.
Nicole, there's been quite a few questions about the outcome of votes and auditing. I've shared a couple of auditing related articles written by our colleagues at PKF, Octagon, Alistair, and Monique, and I'm going to share 1 or 2 of the webinars as well. There's been quite a good question about the issue that you've just mentioned now, the declaration of the outcome of the votes in the minutes, and the actual procedural steps that are taken. I know that you and Matthew are going this afternoon to a colleague managing agent's office to actually go and count votes. Perhaps you could tell the members a little bit about that particular matter and what you're planning on doing, and of course how that scheme was able to not declare the minutes, the outcome of the votes at the meeting, and the reasons for that.
Yeah, so Matthew and I are just going to, like you mentioned, to some offices this afternoon, as we've been just tasked to ensure that from a compliance and STSMA perspective, all of the correct, as we mentioned, AGM procedures were followed correctly now. So there was just a bit of, I don't know what the word is.
Unhappiness.
Uncertainty. There was a bit of uncertainty with regard to whether everything was done 100% according to the STSMA. It's a very tricky situation, as it is a sectional title scheme that has many components in it. There's a share block, there's commercial components, there's residential components. So it's a very tricky setup. And they just want to make sure that, all the processes in terms of the STSMA as well as the, use agreement of the share block, as well as any of the additional rules were complied with correctly. The persons who were present were validly present in terms of proxies and had a right to participate in the meeting. And essentially what the scheme is hoping to achieve with us being there is just to confirm that everything was done above board and was complied with correctly. Because if it is found that, perhaps the meeting wasn't called correctly, or, maybe some of the proxies weren't valid, I don't know the situation, obviously, this is just speculation, then of course it could have an effect on the validity of the votes at that meeting, which would result in them perhaps having to call a meeting afresh, or having to take those resolutions via round robin, depending on what the situation is.
Thank you, Nicole. There was actually a question, what is the recourse if voting was not conducted properly at an AGM? Financials were approved, where the auditor did not address the items required by the SDSMA. So I think the first point there is that financials are not approved, but you've commented nicely on what is the recourse if the voting wasn't conducted correctly. So in this particular case that you're going to be dealing with this afternoon, if you find that the voting wasn't done correctly, what is your suggested advice to the managing agent and the trustees going to be?
It would either be, depending on the nature of the resolutions. If they are ordinary resolutions, I think Matthew would agree with me, obviously, to call the meeting afresh, but also depending on the nature of the matter and also the feelings of the members, perhaps it might be better going via round robin, that route.
100%.
Fantastic. There was another good question that has just been raised about quorum. Now, we know that even colleagues in our close circle are of the opinion that you only need to meet your quorum requirements at the start of the meeting. And if anybody leaves during the course of the meeting, but not necessarily when the voting is concluded, that it doesn't affect your quorum. Our view is different. Perhaps you just want to comment on that, Nicole and Matthew.
Yeah, so it's quite it took me a long time to wrap my head around this. But essentially, if you think about it, every time someone, so say, for example, you start your meeting and you have 35% quorum. Okay, so you kind of just make it with the quorum requirements. Now, you have the welcoming and you confirm everything. And right before the first voting item, someone drops off or someone has to go take an urgent phone call. For all intents and purposes, that person is no longer considered to be at the meeting. And should they return at a later stage, they are not permitted to vote on the items that they were not present for, because technically they haven't really participated or considered the matter, because they would just be voting from, from another member saying, oh, this is what we talked about, this is what they said. So they haven't had a chance to independently exercise their votes. And therefore it would not be considered to count towards that voting resolution. But if they are present for the remainder of the resolutions, and they are present for the remainder of the meeting, then they would be considered present and would count towards quorum.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Here's a nice question for you, Matthew. It's something that you're busy working on for a couple of schemes, and without you knowing about it, I'm planning on involving you in another one today. What information should the annual general meeting pack contain? So if we look at the prescribed management rule 17, it deals with the order of business, but it doesn't really tell us what that pack needs to contain. Perhaps you want to run through a couple of these items.
Yeah, sure. So the most important things, the general things, like I see Sandra Lodder actually gave us a nice little summary of it. It's the notice and agenda, that's definitely there. The minutes have to be included for consideration by the members as part of the pack, because you can't vote on something that you haven't seen. And the owners would generally get first sight of it as part of the meeting pack for the AGM. So that's super important. Minutes have to be there. Nomination form for trustees have to be there. Proxy form has to be there, so perfect. The insurance document, the insurance schedule, and the annual financial statements does not have to be audited financial statements, just the annual financial statements for consideration by the members. The 10-year maintenance plan can be there, but it doesn't have to be. as part of the meeting pack. But the budget, the proposed...
Which is quite a shock, we know.
Yes, so the proposed budget has to be in the meeting pack. However, quotes for jobs, I would recommend including quotes for jobs if you want the members to consider those quotes. But if it's a voting item, like a special resolution, say you want to have an improvement on common property, that's not reasonably necessary in terms of PMR 20, then definitely you would need to include the quotes for jobs to substantiate the costs of any jobs that will be undertaken if the resolution is passed, for example, by the members. Trustee reports, absolutely. The trustee or the chairman's report for the previous year should be included in the meeting pack. Auditor findings, because the annual financial statements just have to be considered, the auditor findings do not have to be included in the meeting pack for the AGM. And then if any resolutions are being tabled, for example, the creation of exclusive use areas, layout plans would need to be included, schedules of allocation would need to be included if you're amending your conduct rules, for example, or management rules to create exclusive use areas, you need to include that as well. So it really depends on what your items of business, those additional items of business will contain in your AGM. So if you're tabling any resolutions, there would need to be motivations for those resolutions included, as well as the actual resolutions.
Fantastic.
Sorry, I just want to add to what Matthew said. If you are going to be voting on what you perceive to be some contentious issues, I know when schemes vote on rules, it's always a contentious issue. So it's always my recommendation to trustees, when they are going to be discussing something, you know, that they foresee as being potentially contentious at an AGM or at an SGM, please consider circulating the documents even before you send the pack out, especially with regards to rules. When you send it out a little bit earlier, it gives you as the trustees time to consider any queries, consider any issues that come up with regards to the documents, and it gives you a chance to amend it before sending out the pack. Because something very, very important that I don't think we touched on was, once the pack gets sent out, all of those documents within the pack can't really be amended again. I mean, besides the agenda, of course, depending on who calls the meeting, but the resolutions and the contents of those resolutions, the content of those documents cannot be materially changed. Obviously, if there's a typo or, you know, maybe there's a better word that you want to use, obviously that's different. How, or at least how Zelinda and I like to consider a material change, is that if it is somehow going to take away rights from certain people, that would be a material change, and that's not fair to happen at the meeting.
Perfect.
So I just wanted to add on to that.
Matthew, you gave us a heart attack. Clarify that, please.
I meant audited financial statements. The audited financial statements don't have to be included in the pack.
So we were having quite a nice discussion about that on the chat, both directly as well. And you would have noticed that I've, tried to answer as many questions as I could over the chat. It's part of our birthday webinar that we try to give as much answers to questions as possible. Last year, we did a Q&A before. So I wasn't taking away from Nicole and Matthew's spotlight at all. It was just as part of the birthday webinar to answer as many questions as possible. But there were quite a few questions about whether or not the AGM is the only place that audited financial statements can be presented. And I know this is it's a very hot topic and a very debated topic. We actually had our colleagues at PKF Octagon, as I mentioned earlier, deal with it. I posted 2 of their articles as well as their webinar on the chat, the links if you'd like to go and have a look. And I'll ask them to do a follow-up webinar or article on this specific topic as well. It is possible to call your annual general meeting within the 4 months by not waiting for the financial statements to be audited. Now, the question is, what on earth is a set of financial statements or annual financial statements if it's not audited? Only the auditor prepares this. So it's a strange topic or concept. And I must say that I've not ever been or heard of, and I'll be interested to hear from you as the attendees, of an annual general meeting where the audited financial statements were not presented. But basically, there were a lot of complaints about annual general meetings being held late, and the excuse that was being used, sometimes true, most of the times not, and I speak from experience there, that the audit was not completed in time. So the legislature did two things. They first proposed that the financial year of any, or financial year end rather, of any new scheme be changed. So you'll notice that it has changed from February to, correct me if I'm wrong, September. Correct, because most auditors, you can imagine, are very busy over the February period. So that assists with new schemes. You're also allowed to change your financial year end by ordinary resolution, should you so choose. A lot of schemes don't do that, but it is something that is on offer. And the legislature suggested that annual general meetings must be held within 2 months of the financial year end. There was such an uproar about it that they kept the 4 months, but in exchange, they provided that you do not need to table audited financial statements at the AGM. Now, because that is a consideration item, one can imagine that if meeting attendance and quorum is such a challenging thing, that even less people are going to attend a special general meeting to only deal with the consideration of financial statements, which is why most schemes either change their financial year end, call an AGM in time, or call it a little bit late. And quite honestly, the only thing that is going to happen to you, again, my experience, if you don't hold an annual general meeting within time, is you're going to get a rap over the knuckles, or if somebody's going to take you to the CSOS, you're going to get an order that says hold an annual general meeting, in which case you can probably hold it in any event. So it's a bit of an item that is not really utilized, but it most certainly is available there. I'd like to open the floor to any verbal questions or comments. So please feel free to unmute yourself, ask your questions. I see there's quite a few questions on the chat that we can go to again, but please feel free to ask your questions to us now.
I see Carlos had a question about the 10-year maintenance plan.
I just double checked and it's not, which is crazy. It's crazy.
Because it absolutely, you're correct, Carlos, it absolutely does affect the budgets, especially with the reserve fund. And that's why I remember when I was still a managing agent, we would include it as part of the meeting. But it's not required in terms of the prescribed management rules to actually include the 10-year maintenance plan along with the proposed budgets in the pack.
Fantastic. Marion, you switched your video off. That means you're ready to ask a question. Let's go for it. Just unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, here, yes, now. Yes, we did hold an AGM without audited annual financial statements a few years ago. This was because we were running out of the 4 months, and we actually wanted to put a special resolution there in order to dismiss the managing agent, because they were basically the reason why the audited financial statements were not ready. They were a disaster. So yes, we had I put together a lookalike, I sort of copied the style of the previous annual financial statements and put together something, labeled it interim draft all over the place, put it to the owners. We had the AGM. In fact, we didn't need to terminate the managing agent because they resigned a couple of weeks before the AGM. So that saved us some trouble there. And then when the financial statements were audited a couple of months later, I was quite aware of the requirement to send them to put them to a special general meeting. But our owners are, they're difficult enough to get them to come to an AGM. So the trustees decided that because there was no significant difference between the audited ones and the prelim ones, we mailed them to all owners and said, does anybody want a special general meeting? And absolutely nobody came back. So we didn't hold that special general meeting, but we did put them forward again at the next AGM. So we did get them formally approved there. So I don't think our owners were disadvantaged in any way. But
fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you, Marion. Thank you for sharing that with us. That is literally my first experience, or first time I heard that that a body corporate actually did that. So it's fantastic. Ladies and gents, I'm sure you'll recognize Marion's name. She's a long-standing trustee at a very well-known scheme, and it's always very interesting to get her view on issues. Sandra agrees with you as well. Aubrey, you also switched your video on. I'm assuming you're also wanting to give us some information this morning. Just unmute yourself.
Thank you. Now I have a question. If an owner receives the pack and it's totally inadequate, no proper financials, just typed out some, very not above board. The owner complains, but nothing happened. The meeting starts. What does the owner do to declare this meeting as not legitimate, or because otherwise the body corporate just carry on, decisions are made, not knowing better? Is what's the correct legal way to not having the meeting carry on and decisions being made without having to go to CSOS later?
Yeah, so it is a bit of a difficult one, because if you one lone voice, you're going to have to shout very, very loud for anybody to hear you, both physically and theoretically. But the moment you get that notice, you first need to see what issues can potentially invalidate the meeting, and things like not having the prescribed agenda where it's material, not sending out copies of information or comprehensive summaries of information that is going to be considered and or voted on, not sending the notice out correctly, not sending it out to all of the owners, not sending it out in time. Those are all things that can potentially invalidate the meeting. If all owners agree in writing for that meeting to continue despite the invalidity, that meeting can continue. But again, it's not something that I've seen. That particular owner needs to raise it prior to the meeting going ahead. They need to draw as much attention to it as possible amongst their fellow owners. If for whatever reason the trustees or the managing agent or both ignore him or her and it goes to the meeting, I would never recommend that you don't attend. I would recommend that you attend and you dispute the validity of the meeting from the get-go. I mean, don't, be a crazy owner jumping up and down, screaming and shouting, I've done that, it doesn't work. You need to make sure that it's part of the records, get enough support together, call a special general meeting to deal with everything properly, alternatively go to CSOS. But hopefully, if you address it the correct way, in the correct manner, pointing out the relevant provisions of the Act, getting as much support together, perhaps getting support from, us or any other specialist sectional title attorney to give you that written, opinion as to what has been done wrong and how it can be amended, then it can go forward. Unfortunately, you can't have the meeting stand adjourned and then continue 7 days later, because that's only for a lack of quorum. They'll have to call a fresh meeting, fresh notice, deal with everything correctly. It happens very often. And if I was on the side of the body corporate or the trustees, I would really have to look with a fine-tooth comb as to what is materially defective, what prejudice you have suffered. But knowing you, I'm sure that the example that you put forward it's really, really wrong and it needs to be corrected. So yeah, unfortunately, it will culminate in going to CSOS, but there is quite a bit that you can do beforehand.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, this is typical where there's no managing agent and where the same 3 trustees have been running it for 10 years, and it just became, a little law on its own, and the rest of the owners are not particularly interested in it, but 1 or 2 people realize that things are going terribly wrong.
Yeah, thank you, Aubrey. Sandra, you got your hand raised?
Yes, good morning all. So like Marion says, I've had a similar experience with, we discovered that the managing agent was actually incorrect in what they were doing in terms of getting the audit ready. They were delaying the process, so we couldn't actually have our AGM. So that raised red flags for me. So since then we had changed managing agents. So far, I can definitely confirm it's definitely changed the whole ball game. Things are going much better. So I think trustees also need to educate themselves, hold the managing agent accountable in terms of what they need to do, but they need to empower themselves, make sure they are fully aware of what they're doing, what they need to do, how, what, and when, and all of that. That being said, the question that I have for you is, in terms of the minutes, who's responsible for doing the minutes and how soon must it go out? Because if it's only distributed just before the next AGM, it's not fresh in everybody's minds anymore. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
I'm going to ask Matthew, as a previous managing agent and minute extraordinaire. He used to get such lovely compliments on his minutes, to answer that question for you, Sandra.
Well, so I would send out the minutes within 7 days anyway, like a normal trustee meeting, to the owners. And then surprisingly, I didn't get a lot of comments on it. So, but I just felt if you're going to send out, I completely agree with you. If you're going to send out minutes almost a year later or longer, you're not going to get a reasonable response from owners in any event. So you need to put the ball in their court, send out the minutes as soon as you can afterwards. Usually those owners that did participate, if there was an oopsie in the minutes and they feel like their or response or queries raised at the meeting wasn't properly covered in the minutes, then they would say that. But it's not a requirement for you to send it out like, immediately afterwards. It only has to be approved at the following AGM, but it's good practice to send it out to owners after the meeting as soon as possible, so that as part of the meeting pack for the next year, those AGM minutes, owners had the opportunity to comment on it. Owners can't say at the meeting, look, we're only catching sight of these minutes now. I would do that, and I would do that for all of my meetings. And you'd be surprised, some owners just have a sense of apathy towards it, but then at least as the managing agent and as the trustees, you can say these minutes were tabled very soon after the meeting, and this is the final set that be included in the packet for your approval and consideration.
Correct.
So yeah.
Just to clarify there, Matthew, when it comes to the annual general meeting minutes, in sectional title, all minutes have to be provided within 7 days of the meeting, trustee resolution, annual general meeting. But where owners come back with comments or questions, or even trustees come back with comments or questions, there isn't a timeline that those need to be sent out. So in my opinion, when minutes of an annual general meeting is sent out and owners that are in attendance and sometimes those that are not in attendance come back with amendments and they say, oh, that wasn't wrong and I said this and so-and-so said that. Firstly, minutes need to be a recording of the motions tabled and the votes taken. It cannot be a he said, she said. And the moment you even start doing the he said, she said, it's going to open up the door to turn it into a transcription, which it is not. That's what the recording is for, or that's what a transcription is for if necessary. So if an owner comes back and says, oh, we actually spoke about this or this or this, take their comments on board and table it at the next annual general meeting, because that is where the minutes need to be amended. You don't have to deal with those amendments and then send out an amended version, because you might end up with a situation of a tennis game. People first make this amendment, then make this amendment, then make that amendment. Matthew's quite right. It only gets tabled for comment, amendment, approval at the next annual general meeting. But the first draft obviously needs to go out 7 days after the AGM. Now, we very often deal with situations representing owners where the owner requests a copy of the minutes in draft and the managing agent says they're waiting for the trustees to approve it. Now, there's no such thing as trustee approved AGM minutes. The minutes must be sent out to all owners 7 days after the meeting. The trustees can't go and tamper with the minutes or approve the minutes or sign the minutes off or anything along those lines. Interestingly, the CSOs, when they accept conduct and management rules, they want a signed copy of the AGM or SGM minutes to be tabled. Nicole's an expert at that. And we always say, put a draft through it, because the chairperson or the trustees, it's not actually the chairperson that needs to sign it, it's any trustee, cannot approve those AGM or SGM minutes until they're approved by the members. So it's actually wrong of the CSOs to request a signed copy. I assume that they're asking for a signed copy to prove that that is the last version, because obviously you're not going to have an SGM or an AGM within 10 days when the rules have to be submitted. The other thing about minutes that we often find is just availability of it. So there isn't anything wrong with sending minutes out to any owner or person authorized by an owner requesting it. You don't hold on to it until it's approved at the next trustee meeting or until it's approved at the next annual general meeting. It most certainly has to go out. And then there's also always a very big question about the recording of a meeting. So if we were the managing agents and we were hosting this annual general meeting via Zoom, this Zoom account is in our name. It's our recording. We can use this recording for purposes of making sure the minutes are done correctly, and we can delete it or not save it or whatever. It's got nothing to do with anybody. If, however, we have been directed or it's part of our management agreement or the platform belongs to the body corporate or is paid for by the body corporates, then I believe that recording forms part of the records. That being said, in terms of PMR 27, an audio recording or recording is not part of that list. I just don't see the harm in giving a recording, but I think people expected as opposed to simply using it for its purpose. I was in a consult yesterday, last story from my side, where we were asked by a group of owners attending a trustee meeting if we could record the session, which the managing agent did. And while an owner put their camera on, they were holding a recording device up in the air like this to get the audio of the call. And I said to him, so you've asked permission for us to record it, which we've done. You haven't asked permission to record this. It's too late now. The meeting's almost over, but we all need a copy of that recording because people can do strange things to a recording. One last question online that I'd like to answer before we take one or two more from the floor is just this issue about a quorum. Vanessa, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and chat us through this particular quorum issue, but it is our strict view that you have to maintain a quorum throughout the business of the meeting. And if anybody leaves, they are going to reduce the quorum, which obviously can have quite an instrumental impact if you're sitting on the verge of meeting your quorum requirements. Vanessa, I'm not too sure if you'd like to ask a specific
can you hear me? I have unmuted.
Yes,
Okay, there's a lot of fighting in our complex. It sounds terrible. We really are a complex at war. There's a lot of people against each other. And what some people are planning, there's a lot of talk about it. I am a trustee. Some people shout and talk over people. So one group is saying, if that one shouts, we're going to get up and walk out. And the other lot is saying, if this one does that, we're going to walk out. So it sounds like they're going to wait for the meeting to, once we start discussing things, then this eruption's going to take place. So from that point of view, would the meeting have to be stopped? It would reduce the quorum. It's terrible at the moment. I don't know if other complexes are going through this, but
I have heard, Vanessa, it's not I like to kind of think of it as like almost like mafia voting, like holding votes hostage in a way, because it really is like that. I've heard so many schemes, especially where there is like an owner that has a large PQ, that has the potential to sway a vote. I've heard a lot of instances where, they'll say, okay, well, what will I get if I vote in favor, kind of thing, and it's really sad because, bodies, corporates, it's community schemes, like community living, like like the whole point is that everyone lives in a harmonious environment and trying to improve the community, like for all persons that live in the scheme. But it's so common that there are just some people living in community schemes that do not seem to be community minded.
That's right, yes. So would the meeting then be stopped? Would it, if it reduces the quorum?
Yeah, you'd have to adjourn it.
Okay.
Beyond the minimum. So your quorum is 33.3% of the total PQ. Obviously dependent on the size, 4 more units. And if that's the case, you'd have to keep an eye on it. And if you do go below that 33.3%, it will have to be stopped. If it is still a 33.3 or a little bit more, the meeting can continue, but you need to keep an eye on that.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Perfect. Anyone else? Marion, yes, go for it.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick one on minutes. I admit, as a retired person that does the minutes, I have the luxury of time, but actually I did start doing this even before I was retired. I do the minutes for our meetings, mostly because I got into the habit when we had this really bad managing agent that used to make a real mess of them. Now we have a much better managing agent, but I'm still in the habit of doing the minutes. But whether it's for an AGM or trustee meeting, but more importantly, since you're talking about AGMs, I will type up the minutes the next day. Sometimes it takes me another day as well to check some things, but then I send the first draft within 2 or 3 days while minds are fresh to every attendee, whether they were owners or any, proxies, managing agents, staff, anybody else who was there. So it's all fresh in their minds. And of course, they're the only people who can dispute the minutes.
100%.
I get the odd comment back, and obviously fix things when necessary. So within the 7 days, or sometimes it takes 8 days or whatever, when you send that out to all the owners, you know that in practice there can't be any more changes, because if all the attendees have said they're okay, then nobody, either an attendee or a non-attendee, can come back with complaints later.
Yeah.
Just a tip.
No, it's a
And I
fantastic.
can't tell you
Fantastic.
how many times at an AGM, Zelinda and I have been in attendance where an owner tries to dispute the minutes, but they weren't even at that meeting. So it's like, okay, but how do you know?
Told me.
There's actually, the funniest was that in our recent general meeting where we were approving the minutes of the previous AGM, quite a few people voted yes or no for the minutes of the previous meeting when they didn't attend. So yeah, I'm not quite sure what they're voting for.
Yeah.
So I think some of them voted no, not because they disagreed with them, but because they weren't there, which is just nonsense. Yeah.
Oh dear. Aubrey, we'll take one last one from you, and then I'm going to hand over to Nicole T.
Thank you. Yeah, perhaps it's a bit petty, but relevant. In the meeting, let's say you just reach your quorum and somebody get a phone call and walks out. Must the meeting at that point be adjourned, or is it only with the voting? And let's say 5 minutes later, that person come back. Can you restart the meeting? How does it work?
That is a really difficult one. So, I mean, I have chaired many meetings, and I've been a managing agent at many meetings, and you know, it's not possible to keep an eye on everyone. And I'm going to talk about physical meetings first. I mean, Matthew, I can imagine, you know, you dealt with it as well. Hundreds of times you're looking at the audience and somebody gets up to go to the bathroom. You know, I mean, are they now not part of the meeting anymore? If your meeting is sitting literally at like one person is going to make the difference, then yes, you should say, everyone, hold on. So-and-so went to go take a call, or hang on, so-and-so, you can't leave right now. We're about to vote. You know, that's the way that you need to. And yes, it sounds like it's petty, but that's exactly what you have to do. Now, I think it was Marion that raised a very good point about remote meetings. How do you know that everyone's present? If I've got my camera off, Serena's got a camera off, Sandra's got a camera off, Marion's got a camera off, how do we know that they're actually participating right now? You know, they could be having their breakfast in the kitchen and they can't hear the laptop, or they might be on a phone call or speaking to a colleague. How do we know? So this whole concept of affecting the quorum is very difficult to prove, especially with remote meetings. If you are sitting in that situation with literally one person leaving the meeting affecting the quorum, then I believe that you should stop. Matthew, do you agree, disagree? Interesting story to tell.
Completely agree. It's like you said, the big problem is with virtual meetings now, not so much with physical, because you can see people. And it's not a requirement for people to put their cameras on in terms of the act. You just have to show that they are able to participate in the meeting. It's not that they have to. So what does participation mean? You know, do I have to put my camera on now with virtual meetings? We don't know, but it's like Zelinda says, you would have to monitor it, especially when there's a very close quorum, to make sure that people don't fall off of the meeting during the meeting. And that's when these applications like Meeting Pal are extremely useful, especially with voting, because you check it electronically, it's immediate. Nobody's sitting with an Excel spreadsheet or checking the attendance of the meeting themselves. So those assistance programs really do help with that, with monitoring quorum.
Fantastic.
Will it be good enough to make an announcement in the beginning of the meeting that people will be assumed to be attending the meeting until they have formally excused themselves?
It's a good idea. Definitely a good idea. Yeah. And anybody in that meeting that is going to potentially dispute it can raise their dispute at that point in time. Yeah, I think
Yes,
that's
but because it's technically impossible, even in a meeting where you can see people. I mean, if you move out of the room, it's not necessary that your intention is to leave the meeting. You just for a moment not there or whatever, or you. So if you make the announcement, at least then people have the right to excuse themselves in a legal way without you having to keep track of.
Yeah. And embarrass them and say, where are you off to? James picked me. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Aubrey. Nicole T, over to you.
Yes, I had a comment earlier and then I realized I was talking to myself because I was on mute. So why is nobody like acknowledging
No one's
me?
listening to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on your comments, Alinda, about the recording of meetings. Interestingly enough, in South Africa, you can record a meeting without letting anybody know, or a conversation without letting anybody know, provided that you are partaking in that conversation. So if I'm sitting here listening to you now and I'm recording on my phone, that's completely fine. I don't need to let anybody know. But if I needed to get up and step out of my office, then it becomes illegal because now I'm not part of that conversation anymore. So just a little food for thought.
So that one time I left my phone in the boardroom and walked away, that was naughty of me. Okay.
Correct, yes. Well, unless you had consent. If you have consent, then obviously it's fine.
That's why you learn you need to learn every single day, ladies and gents. That's my philosophy. Nicole, do you want to say a farewell for us and then we can close off?
Be Nicole.
I meant Nicole T, but either Nicole, no problem.
You go for it, Nicole T.
I'm not used to being called Nicole by Zelinda. But yeah, thank you so much to everybody for joining us. Like Zelinda said at the beginning, it's been a remarkable 3 years, which would not have been possible with each and every one of you. And we look forward to having you on our next webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.